So I asked the question, what is Baroque about Versailles? And I note that the use of light here, the use of water, and the use of mirrors, to me really stands out as the way that energy and contrast are created, not just in the structure, but also just at this location. And as I said in the last video, to me, Laveau is thinking very much about the personality of his client, who is commissioning this property, and is trying to create a theatrical set for them to live their lives on. And as I mentioned, Louis XIV was a very theatrical man. One of my favorite stories about him is that one of his mistresses, because the king's always had a lot of mistresses, one of his madames, during the height of summer, complained that she missed wintertime. And that supposedly what he did was he sugared the grounds. He had his servants go out and sugar a part of the grounds so that the grounds looked like snowy, and then had them take out one of the sleighs and put like the horses with the sleigh bells, and that he basically surprised her by having her come outside for a winter's ride. And, think about all the time and energy that's put into basically a spoiled brat's request. Like, oh, I hate the heat, wish it was winter, boo-hoo. And he makes for her like a winter fairyland. That's about as theatrical as you can get. So I think everything here was really meant to complement this idea of grand drama and great theater. You see the use of light throughout the grounds, both inside and outside. And the water often facilitates that. I like this shot here where you see one of the fountains, and then you're looking down towards the long reflecting pool, in a sense, that they also would go out and boat on. And this idea of the water, the light, all playing together. And then inside the structure, you'll see a lot of use of mirrors. And I think everything here is meant to create energy, create contrast. So I just take you kind of for a walk around the grounds a little bit, and then take you inside the structure as well. So the gardens here are quite notable. They were designed by the landscape architect Andre Lenotre, and he worked alongside Laveau to make a different part, in a sense of the theater, right, set. And you'll note that a lot of the gardens here are what were called designed gardens or organized gardens. They're not meant to be wild, right? They're meant to be architectural. And very, very strict and rigid in how they're designed. They're meant to be symmetrical and geometric and have patterns that are closely enforced. Another story I really love about Versailles is the story of the gardens and how much energy it took to upkeep them. Supposedly there were greenhouses on the property that had they say around 1 million different types of flowers and trees. Sometimes I'm like, that can't be the right number, but that's what they say. That they had all these different trees and different flowers and just different varietals, in a sense, that when the king got bored of something, they could just switch them out. So from what I know of the gardens, everything's like in its own little tub or pot, where, except for the bordering, shrubs and stuff, where they could be removed and then replaced. So if you got tired of a color scheme, let's say, or wanted some interesting new trees, right, that they could switch things out without too much, headache on their parts. But again, this idea that to him it wasn't a natural place, that Louis XIV saw this as a very constructed place, plays out in these stories, and what Lenotre designed and hoped to have it function. This is the orangery at the palace, and I always think this speaks even more so to fantasy, because oranges weren't something that flourished in French climate. I noted when we looked at still life painting in the Dutch area that lemons, oranges, like citrus fruits, typically came from Spain, because the climate there was good for them. It's the same as like a Florida climate, right? It's good for growing citrus fruit. So France gets very cold in the winter. It gets very snowy. It's not the best place to grow oranges, but he wanted an orangery. But notice that everything's in kind of pots. So once again, you could take everything in and out as needed. So during the wintertime, the orangery would be taken into the greenhouses. But again, it just speaks to a certain type of luxury and fantasy that was trying to be created here and really, fostered here. And I love the fountains. There's fountains throughout the property. You're looking at the famous fountain directly behind the palace, right, looking again down to the reflecting pool. And something very interesting about the fountains, they can't all be run at the same time. There's not enough water here. So there's a story where if the king wanted to go out walking and see his fountains, the story was that you had a group of people who were running in front to turn the fountains on. The king would walk past, and then there was another group of people who ran behind to turn that fountain off. So when they turned the next fountain on, it would run. There just wasn't enough water throughout the property to have all the fountains running simultaneously. So it speaks to the dearth of water here. But it also just speaks to the fantasy of it. It reminds me of like Disney World. I'm a big Disney person. I love it there. And one of the reasons I think I love it is because it is a simulacrum. It is meant to be a fantasy. It's meant to be the most happiest place on earth. You cross the boundaries or the gates and nothing there can touch you. Everything is fun and fabulous, and you get your Dole Whip and you go on your rides and everyone's happy and jolly and having a great day. Have a magical day is what they say to you. So, but a lot of what goes on to keep Disney World running happens below the surface or behind the scenes. In Magic Kingdom, it literally is below the surface. The park's actually built on an elevated walkway system. So when you're up walking around, there's actually tunnels beneath you where the cast are moving about. This is why you rarely see somebody from like Frontierland in Tomorrowland. There's no reason you should see them walking from one place to the other. They move underground to get to where they need to go, thus keeping the fantasy intact for you, that you are in Frontierland or you are in Fantasyland and so on and so forth. And so, this idea of these elevated walkways, but all the people scurrying around underneath, making this fantasy possible for you, that's, to me, a very similar connection to what was going on at Versailles. All these people behind the scenes scurrying around to make the king's dreams come true, make the fantasy live. The famous Apollo fountain, both off and on. And why I show you this fountain especially, because he was the Sun King. Apollo is the god of the sun. So you'll notice he's riding this chariot in a sense. In the mythology, he's riding a chariot pulling the sun across the sky, and that's how the sun moves, right? So Louis XIV literally aligned himself mythologically with Apollo and used Apollonian, imagery because he was the Sun King. And again, you can walk all over the grounds, right, and get to see these beautiful statues and different fountains throughout. My husband and I go to France. Not as much as we used to, but we used to go fairly often. I actually was where we were engaged. So we have a lot of love for Paris and love for France. So a lot of the pictures you're seeing are there from when we went one Christmas time when we were over in France. And just us taking sort of a tours around the gardens and such. The gardens, by the way, it's free to go and tour the gardens. It is not free to go in the house, and often there's quite a long line. They've really stepped up their online ticketing system. I definitely take advantage of that, because if you go and try to physically buy tickets, the lines can be hours long. It's quite ridiculous at certain points of the year. But the grounds are always free and open for you to go wander around. The statue on the left is Louis XIV kind of as Poseidon, or like a sea god. So you'll notice he loves mythology and loves kind of placing himself in the theatricality of like, I am this god, or I'm showing myself in the guise of that god and such. And he loved to use that type of imagery. This is the famous Apollo grotto. Again, as I mentioned, Louis XIV loved sort of saying he was Apollo. So in the center, you have a statue of him with sort of nymphs, attending to him, and then other statuary sort of placed along the waterfall. Everything about the gardens was really very much about, kind of this fantastical world. And the later people who lived here, like Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they often created their own fantasies, because Marie Antoinette, for instance, she loved to have this fantasy of living as if she was a little shepherd's wife, a little shepherdess. And she actually had a little village built to the south of Versailles, where she had servants live there who dressed up like they were like living in a little village, like, they were agricultural people. And she would come down and she'd live amongst them like she was like just a typical woman who was there to like milk goats and hang out in the countryside. It's quite startling to think that this queen wanted to get away from this sumptuous palace, right, and go live like she was a sheep herder, basically. But that's the fantasy that she created, was this idea of this pastoral, idyllic, no worries, no troubles. I live like a simple person. So I always say each king who lived here, up through Louis XVI, of course, getting beheaded, in a sense, to me, kept embellishing the fantasy or creating the fantasy a little bit more for themselves. We now go inside, and so you're seeing the famous Galerie de Glace, or the Hall of Mirrors. And the Hall of Mirrors is on the back side of the palace. It looks out to the fountain and down to the reflecting pool. So it's right there on the back side. It gets good sun exposure throughout the day, good light. And one side is windows and one side is mirrors. Now first, let me note that mirrors at this time were still very expensive. And they were leaded mirrors, as we call them. So they would not look like the mirrors you are used to seeing today. They would have had this sort of hazier, darker quality to them because they were called what we call leaded mirrors. They're made with lead, and they weren't completely clear, right, the way we think of mirrors today. So they had a very distinct, different quality to them. But they were expensive, and they were a show of wealth. So for him to have a whole wall of glass mirrors was like, whoa, this guy is wealthy. And I think what he wanted to do with this space is create a very theatrical space that he used for receiving people or visiting with people, visiting dignitaries, visiting court members, and also one you could use for balls or parties. When I think of him receiving people, the notion I get of how he used it was that he'd throw open one side of the doors. We're looking down towards a door here in the photo, so imagine that door being thrown open and emerging out of it a few courtiers who announce the king, right? And then he proceeds out wearing, his beautiful garments, hands thrown back, right? And then walks down the length of the room where the court would have been standing where the windows are, with the mirrors reflecting him over and over and multiplying his visage, right, over and over and over again. I can only imagine it'd be a very dramatic experience, something, again, worthy of a movie. And to me, he thought about how his presence could be enhanced with every space that he had commissioned. And this space to me was about multiplying his power over and over through the use of the mirrors, impressing and startling those who were in this space. I love it. I can't say enough about how theatrical this really would have been. Today, of course, this is a museum. So the way we see it today is very, very different than it would have functioned in Louis XIV's time. And if you go there most times of the year, it's filled with tourists, right? So it's very, very bustling, and it's hard to even get a breath, much less really think about how the space would have functioned well. So again, when you look at these pictures of it empty, it's very different than seeing it in person. This is the other space I wanted to show you, which is the Salon de la Guerre, or the Room of War. A salon is a room in French. Guerre, of course, is war. So when I will start to talk later about the salons, remember that it literally is a room. That's what it is. But the French will start to host little parties or little philosophical get-togethers that they call the salons. And again, it derives from the term room. I wanted you to think about how ceremonial this space is, how grandiose this space is, and how Baroque spaces don't lend themselves to a sense of warmth or comfort. When we look at Rococo next, I'll contrast this space, let's say, with another Rococo space and have you think about the idea of warmth, comfort. This to me is a space you're not going to curl up in and feel comfortable in. It was meant to impress. So the theatrical function of the room was all. It was not about actual livability. So when you walk around through the Palace of Versailles, I don't believe that Louis XIV commissioned Laveau to make a building that was about comfort for him and his family. It was about being able to impress people. And each space really functions that way. Even his own bedroom, as I mentioned, because his bedroom had this balustrade or this little cordoning off in front of his bed, because that's where people were supposed to stand to watch him rise. Imagine designing a bedroom this way, but that's what he did. So everything he did in this space was about the show. So you'll notice that all the spaces are highly gilded, lots of use of gold throughout, right? Lots of use of big, large carvings or mirrored spaces, parquet floors throughout, paintings on the ceiling in various rooms. Everything is about startling you, right? And making you really think wow, who lives here? So I always love talking about this as one of the sort of final things we see in the Baroque, because I really think it speaks to the huge amount of theatricality that Louis XIV modeled throughout his leadership. Final thing I want to mention just briefly is a little bit about French Baroque painting. So I've mentioned throughout that, each painter that I was going to show you really benefits from Caravaggio's technique or method, his style. And Latour is no different. He takes Caravaggio, what are the building blocks, and he applies them. Dark background, right? Everything close to the picture plane, right? Spotlight. This one's not as dependent on the idea of a diagonal, but again, I noted that each artist would kind of maybe alter it to fit what they were trying to achieve in their painting. So Latour was famous for doing these works that look very Caravaggio-esque and working with religious themes like the Penitent Magdalene that you see here. To me, the Penitent Magdalene, it almost draws in almost Dutch Baroque themes with the use of that skull. So it's a mishing and a mashing of everything we've seen across the spectrum from Italy to Dutch to French. And finally, this is his work, Martyrdom of St. Sebastian. Here you can see the diagonal much more on display, obviously. And if you don't know St. Sebastian's mythology, he was shot through with arrows as part of his martyrdom. So we see him collapsed on the ground here with the arrow protruding from his ribcage, and everyone sort of weeping, the idea of his martyrdom. By the way, the arrows did not kill him. They finally had to behead him, so he was hard to martyr. But you get, again, that same sense of Caravaggio-esque lighting and setting and feel. So again, you can see where Caravaggio's influence carries over, right, the totality of the style of Baroque from the beginning to the end.